All right, guys. Charles Eisenstein is here. Can't wait. This is going to be a big show tonight. If you're not familiar with Charles, get ready. If you are familiar with Charles, you know it's going to be a good show. There he
All right,
is.
here we are. It worked. But I'm always amazed when technology works.
Yeah, me too. It's fascinating. You know, it's a whole different world. I'm sure we'll be talking about that today.
Well, happy to be here, Ben.
It's great to have you, Charles. Thanks so much for taking up my offer and coming on live.
Yeah.
Great, great. So, guys, if you're not familiar with Charles Eisenstein, he is somebody I've been following your work on and off for the last few years, and I've seen a handful of your interviews, and I just said, man, how does his brain work this way? I was pretty amazed at just how you're connecting dots and looking at things from a much broader perspective. And there's just not too many people who can look at things from a standpoint of economics, philosophy, but also the less tangible world of spirituality and oneness or lack of separation, and try to tie all these things together, and then also using this to kind of create a vision of where we could be going in as a society. So I've just been fascinated by your work and your mind. And if you're not familiar with Charles, just want to mention a few of his books too and what he's done. And by the way, he's now on Substack, and you have to check that out. But one of your books, that the first one that I heard was Sacred Economics. I know you revised that in 2020. He's got another book called The Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible, which I'm excited to talk about that as well. Climate, A New Story, and The Ascent of Humanity, just to name a few, and The Yoga of Eating, which I haven't delved into, but I find to be like quite an interesting topic that I can
Yeah.
relate to. So,
That was my practice book. Yeah.
so well, it's great to have you here. I know we could go in so many different directions, but I think one of the things I truly just want to, what I think my audience is going to be interested in knowing, what I'm personally interested in knowing is, first of all, what's happening in the world today? What's going on out there in terms of this transformation we're going through, revolution maybe we're going through?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I could, talk about that for days. Um, so, like in the big picture, what's happened in the last 2 years is that we've been shown, um, well, for one thing, shown where our society was headed even before COVID took place. Because everything that happened in response to COVID from our authorities and from the public was not actually a change in direction from where we had already been going. The migration of life, of work, of dating, of education, of shopping online, like that wasn't new. That didn't just start in 2020. The obsession with with safety, that didn't start in 2020. That's been going on my whole lifetime. The power of big tech to surveil and censor us, that didn't just start in 2020 either. So we're being shown kind of like a fast forward of where our society was headed, and being because we're shown that, these trends become conscious, whereas before they seemed ineluctable, like unstoppable, just like the nature of things. But now we're being offered a choice. We're being asked, do we really want to go in that direction? Because if we do nothing, that is the way that we will continue to go. More and more integration of tech with the human body, for example. But we don't have to go that way. So this rise into consciousness of formerly semi-conscious or unconscious trends is also a moment where we can claim our sovereignty collectively over the direction of society. And for many people, this also has a personal dimension. So that's maybe like a really big picture view of where we are right now. And if you want, I can zoom in on any aspect of it. But
Great start. I love it. And, I think that's, you know, maybe we could separate them into different sections. The one, we talked about the technology and maybe even call it the transhumanism and how we're kind of going that direction. Another bucket and just kind of laying these out, we could kind of maybe look at them and then jump into one at a time. But the spiritual aspect too of it, as well as, our own personal development, our own personal growth, and our own personal essence of who we are and the role that plays in society, as well as plays in the role of helping humanity to evolve. And that's another category and area I want to get into. And also just really clear on what the agenda is in terms of more of the brick and mortar, the actual, if you want to call it a strategy or plan that's out there. And for me, just kind of jumping back and starting there at that point, what is the actual plan? And the way I see it is, I agree with you from my perspective. The pharmaceutical industry, that's nothing new about what's happening with that and the system that's broken or even corrupted. And I think you can name the banking system and all of them. We're running into all of these. This is now in the limelight. This is here. And it looks like the transition is, we're going through the birthing canal, maybe, in a way.
Yeah.
What do you see is actually the agenda, if I could call it that?
The agenda of whom?
Okay, yeah. I believe that there's kind of a system going on where there's an intentional strategy. I believe there's an involvement of global leaders trying to create a transformation of wealth, the World Economic Forum, the United Nations. I believe there's a hijacking, if you want to call it that, of the current crisis that's in play. Do you see it that way?
To an extent. I think we also should not underestimate the power of narratives, and even I would call them mythologies, that arise organically and unconsciously from the collective, that are not engineered or created by a central power, to then coordinate the actions of people in elite institutions, politics, the media, academia, and so forth, without there actually being a conscious orchestrator of all of these actions. It's like, and I'm not saying that there aren't people with nefarious plans, but this happens too. Like, where in one of my essays, I gave the example of my grade school classroom where everybody just kind of all decided that this one kid was the weird kid. And it's not like somebody sat and planned out a campaign against Kent. It was that it just, like, you kind of know, like, you have this instinct to know who's on the in, who's on the outs. And so everybody starts shunning Kent. I personally had nothing against the kid. But, I was just very close to being the weird kid myself. So I knew instinctively that if I associated with Kent, then I would be lumped in with him and I would be ostracized as well. Everybody either could gain social status by mocking him and excluding him, or was at least afraid to raise their voice. And so it looked an awful lot like a conspiracy against Kent. And in a certain sense, it was a conspiracy, but it was an unconscious conspiracy. So that kind of social dynamic operates in our society and makes it look like there is a conscious, planned agenda when there may not be one. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't one, but when it looks like one, let's be careful to consider these deeper phenomena of mass psychology, because they explain a lot. When you know what the narrative is, when you know what the right thing to say is that will get you included in the in-group, that will avoid making you a target of the mob, then you just know what to say. Like people in the media, you know what to say. I know what to say. Like I know it's going to get me censored. I know it's going to get me denounced.
Right.
And even if nobody is issuing orders to me saying, Charles, don't say this, don't say that, like, okay, I've spoken up and I haven't listened to that social instinct. But we got to understand this, because if we simply diagnose the problem being the medical totalitarian takeover of society, et cetera, if we diagnose that problem only as the doing of a small group of bad people, then we are led down a road to a false solution, which is you just get rid of those bad people. But when you understand that yeah, there are some bad actors, but they are accommodated by a system and an ideology and a narrative. And if we do not change that, getting rid of the bad people isn't going to help, because a new crop will come to fit those places. And that's why I take it to what you're calling the spiritual level. Like, what are the deep belief systems that allow this kind of thing to happen? And I've gone on long enough, but
No,
yeah.
I think it's a perfect segue to really get into the heart of it. I mean, let's do it. What is this more spiritual aspect to it that you're referring to?
Yeah. So first of all, like, let's clarify what we're talking about when we use the word spiritual. I don't think you or I are talking about a unworldly realm separate from the body, separate from materiality. I mean, here you are, like you're, you know, a health guy, a fitness guy, and you know that the state of your body and the state of your mind and the state of your emotions are all connected. And even like the deepest questions you ask yourself, like these are all connected. And the same thing is true on a social level. So we could say, like, beneath the superficial level of policies and practices, what are the beliefs that for example, one of the beliefs would be, or one of the psychologies, let's say, is a phobia and denial of death. If that is in place, and it sure is in place, we see it all over society, from the warehousing of old people in institutions, to the euphemisms we use for death, to the obsession with youth in advertising, to the holding on of financial assets as if you could take them with you. Like, so many ways we're in denial of death. It's not even polite to talk about it. If that's in place, this simultaneous denial and terror, then of course we're going to become obsessed with safety.
Yes.
And all of this sacrifice that we make on the altar of safety, the sacrifice of civil liberties, the sacrifice of singing together and hugging and seeing each other's beautiful faces, all that, it makes sense if the most important thing is safety. So if that doesn't change, if we don't really look at where is that fear coming from, then we're going to always be susceptible, as we have been. I mean, this isn't the first time that we've surrendered freedom in the interest of security. Happened after 9/11 too. Mm-hmm. Like, we were already a terrified population. That's what makes us susceptible to terrorism, because we're already terrified. We were already terrified going into COVID too. People had this latent anxiety, and now COVID comes along and they're given an object of their fear. So they latch onto that. It's actually comforting. This is what we have to understand. It's not like the machinations of totalitarian elites would have no chance at all if they weren't enthusiastically received by a population who was ready and susceptible. And so with this latent anxiety that, and we could go deeper, like, where is that coming from? The alienation of modernity, the cutoff from community, the cutoff from nature,
yep.
The experience of being a separate self in a world of other. Okay, once that's in place, then people will be naturally receptive to an object of their fear, such as a virus. And so, as I was saying, like it's almost a relief because now I can do something about it. Now that I can pinpoint my fear, I can identify my fear. All I have to do is stay indoors, wear a mask, get vaccinated, and the world will be safe because I've concentrated all of the fear into this one thing. So that's another one of these conditions. So yeah, like sure, let's talk about Anthony Fauci and Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab and the like all of those elites, but we're missing 95% of the genesis of this catastrophe if we focus on that.
It's the vision I just got is, if it's dealing with the symptoms and not addressing the cause of the issue, right?
Right.
Kind of health. If you continue to smoke, say you take some drug, you clear your lungs up or whatever it is, and all of a sudden you take a steroid and you're temporarily healed, but then you keep going back to the same mindset, if you want to call it that. You therefore are going to continue to repeat the same patterns. And it's almost, if I'm hearing you right, it's almost as if we need to learn a lesson, or that 95% that you're referencing is more of addressing these bigger issues or coming to a new way of living or a new mindset that's going to keep us from repeating these patterns, whether it was 9/11 or how many other instances that have happened throughout time.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that the essence of this that you're referencing, the 95% that you were talking about a minute ago, comes down to a sense of lack and separation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would say it's not even so much a mindset. I mean, the mindset is another level of it, but underneath that is the level of what I would call the mythology. the mythology, excuse me, the mythology of civilization, so part of that mythology is the worship of control and a conception of progress that says that progress means that human beings exercise more and more complete control over materiality and over each other, over ourselves. And internally too, over ourselves. Like, how do you become a better person? You discipline and control yourself more. How do you become safer? You set a perimeter, like that's a military thing, right? You enforce a perimeter. You enforce the perimeter of your body. You exercise pharmaceutical control over physiological processes. So you have these visions of the future where we ultimately control the weather, we engineer matter down to the nano level, we engineer our genetics, and that's supposed to bring paradise. So there's this conception of progress. Part of the mythology is that human beings used to be in a state of desperate survival anxiety, but technology came to save us. So that's a mythology that explains what human development is, how the world works, even what a human being is, and what's real and how change happens. And that mythology, I call it the mythology of separation. Ultimately, it's what holds humanity separate from nature and self separate from other. So that foundational conception of the self, separate from you, separate from the world, separate from the rest of life. If you take that, if you live from that, of course you want to exert control over all the other beings out there who are not you, because they're trying to do the same thing. It's a war of each against all. And of course, the germs and the viruses are implacable enemies that we become healthier by dominating. Like, all of it makes sense if we accept that that's who we are. And what I'm saying is that is a culturally bound mythology that other human beings who have lived on Earth and in many places still are living, did not subscribe to.
Mhm.
And so the one way you earlier you mentioned like I think you mentioned a birthing process, like it's time to push. And one way to understand our situation now is that this mythology that contained us as a civilization and defined us for so long no longer can accommodate us. Certainly not as individuals nor collectively. It's falling apart in many ways, economically, ecologically, politically. The story can't hold us anymore, and we don't feel at home in it anymore. So the old world is expelling us, and a new world is beckoning. So that maybe is the what we might call a spiritual dimension to what's going on.
Mm. And so my instinct, my mind, the question that arises is, okay, well, how do we ensure a smooth process through this birthing into, again, using the plain language of a great awakening opposed to what people are comparing to the Great Reset, or maybe an agenda that people have planned for us. And so here we are. How do we come about this in a way where we can get the outcome where I guess we're seeking?
Well, I don't think that it's necessarily possible for it to be smooth. If it's like, I don't know if your life has ever fallen apart. If personally, I read your bio a little bit, you were safely um, embosomed in a golden corporate job, the golden handcuffs, you called it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm guessing, like you didn't say like so much detail, but I'm guessing that on the one hand, that paradise became more and more limiting, more and more confining, just as when a fetus grows up against the limits of the womb, more and more intolerable. And at the same time, you probably were shown glimpses that there's actually a much bigger and more beautiful world outside of the confines of your current normality. So that pulled you, and then the breakdown of your circumstances pushed you. I'm just guessing maybe your process was different, but that's how it is for a
That's
lot of
very
people.
accurate. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And the maybe it was really smooth for you, but for most people it isn't.
No.
Like there could be catastrophic breakdown that looks like the worst thing in the world. You get fired from your job, you have a health crisis, you have a marital crisis, you go bankrupt, whatever it is. The world falls apart. Once you move through to the other side, maybe you look back and you say that wasn't so bad after all.
Mm-hmm.
But in the midst of it, it feels like the world is falling apart. You don't know who you are anymore. You don't know what's real anymore. You're bewildered. Everything is uncertain. In that state of vulnerability and humility, because part of it is, gosh, I don't know anymore. It's when all of the cognitive dissonance finally comes to a head and obliterates the structures of knowing and meaning and sense making that you had. That is what generates humility. In a way, it's humiliation that generates humility. Oh gosh, I don't know, after all. And then you're open to understandings that were just utterly off the radar before that happened. Now, I'm sure that some people listening are mapping this onto the current social situation, where the cognitive dissonance is becoming louder and louder for a lot of people who obediently trusted their televisions up until recently. But now it's just like the television is contradicting what it said just a few months ago. Like all of the promises have been shown to be bankrupt. Everyone's double jabbed and boosted and still getting sick. Maybe someone in your sphere has been harmed by the vaccines. Like there's just like, in order to stay in the world in the conceptual world that you had been in requires more and more self-denial. And it just becomes less and less hospitable to a lot of people. Now, I don't know, I'm always surprised by like how many people are still fully bought into the narrative. But I know a lot of people are defecting from it as well. And that is not always a smooth and pretty process. It can be so bewildering. And we just have to accept that. And maybe our job, those of us who have already been through that passage, is to kindly welcome those who are now making their way through it without, I told you so's, without gloating, but in a spirit of brotherhood and sisterhood.
I was talking with my friends. I think the conversation comes up, and we're on the live before, and my friend said, imagine not having had any sense of awareness of kind of how the systems really truly work, in essence, that they weren't broken, that everything was fine. And then all of a sudden, you kind of see the bigger picture. It's like the movie The Matrix, when he comes out and he unplugs himself, and this is the real world. It's dark and there's lightning and the skies are black. And they really paint this, oh my gosh, but you realize that once he gets through the potential that's there and the powers that are available to us once we break through the matrix and through to the other side. And I do think that, you asked me like what had happened to me. Yeah, there was with the business, there was the pain and suffering of not wanting to do this, of feeling empty inside, of but everyone goes through their journey. But then I also woke up to, a father with cancer, and started researching alternative cancer treatments, and peeked beyond that veil and saw that, which led me to the Federal Reserve and how the money system worked, and that opened it up. And so when this came, it just seemed to be this is a general term, but when the crisis hit, it seemed to be another play in the playbook, in essence, of some of the things that were going on. And I felt compelled to say, okay, I think I have a clear understanding of some of the aspects that are happening here. And I'm just feeling this complete inner urge to want to reach out and share and scream from the rooftop and say, let's awaken before we head too far in the other direction, or continue to follow this existing narrative that may not be leading us to the safety and health and promised land that they've been claiming it to be. Mm-hmm. So that's the way I see it, and I have this internal urge. And, from your perspective, waking people up, we always talk about what's the best way to do this. And from your perspective, you mentioned something about being gentle, being kind. How do you see this as a way to go about waking people up?
Yeah. One thing I've discovered is that usually a frontal assault on somebody's belief system doesn't really do very much good.
Yeah.
You can't, as the saying goes, you can't reason somebody out of a belief that they didn't reason themselves into to begin with. So you can marshal all of your evidence and your studies, all of your logic, and they're not going to listen. They're not going to read the studies. They're going to assume that because the studies say something different than what their television is telling them, that the studies must be wrong. I mean, if you trust in the basic integrity of the authorities and of our dominant institutions, then by definition, anything that contradicts them must have some problem with it, must not be credible. Otherwise, the CDC would be saying the same thing. Otherwise, CNN would be saying the same thing. So you're not going to get very far that way. And especially when the so-called fact checkers and debunkers can provide you with ready dismissals of anything that contradicts the narrative. So I'm not saying that reasoned argumentation is always useless. It can be effective when somebody is at that point where they're starting to waver a little bit, and they need um, something to satisfy their logical intellect to allow them to migrate to a new belief system. But generally speaking, I don't see people changing their minds because they've been reasoned out of their beliefs. So then I ask, well, what are the conditions that help somebody, that like even help me? Like under what conditions am I able to admit that I was wrong about something? Under what conditions am I able to question beliefs that I held dear? And for me, one thing is if I feel safe, if I don't feel like I'm being judged, if I don't feel like I'm being attacked, if I don't feel like somebody wants to change my mind as a kind of victory over me, because then I'll resist. I'll defend. I'll become defensive because I actually am not safe because actually that person wants to win a victory. So if we can carry this kind of goodwill where we serve something higher than victory, because that's the other thing. Like, are you so sure that you're right about everything? I guarantee you there's probably something that you're profoundly wrong about. That one day you will be like, oh my God, how did I ever think that?
It's happened.
So what are the circumstances that allow you? Because it takes courage to admit that you were wrong, especially when your public persona, your identity, your belief in yourself as an intelligent person rides on the validity of certain opinions. Like it's really hard to change those opinions, especially if that means being ostracized by people who had once accepted you. So where does that kind of courage come from? And in my experience, it comes from knowing that I'm loved, from being accepted, from, yeah, unconditionally. So I believe that if we orient toward truth and healing above victory, then we become generators of the morphic field of truth and healing. If we don't hold other people's beliefs against them, then we generate the morphic field of surrender, of release, of an easy letting go. And maybe that's the answer to the question of how to make it more smooth. And that's not to say, oh, like let it slide. If like there are occasions, and maybe we're in one of them right now, where innocent people are being harmed, or we're being persecuted, our rights are being denied us. And even without hating or judging the oppressors, we still stand up against that. So I'm not like discounting that and say just become passive and let them roll over you. But we have to understand ultimately the deeper conditions that are generating all of this.